Inside a high-stakes federal budget hearing in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett clashes with Chief Justice John Roberts over a staggering $3.1 billion shortfall in infrastructure funds and the dark ethics behind unchecked judicial power. Roberts, cloaked in arrogance and status, tries to humiliate her with dismissive sarcasm, but just minutes later, Crockett detonates the room with evidence so damning it strips away the illusion of power. The man once untouchable finds himself exposed, cornered, and collapsing under the weight of his own lies. If the nation's highest judge can be dismantled by one woman armed with the truth, just how rotten is the system we've been told to trust? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The marble floor of the Capitol hearing chamber gleamed like a weapon under the overhead lights, polished, cold, and unforgiving. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the double doors in a tailored navy suit, her chin raised, her stride steady. But the second she entered, she could feel it. Hostility, not heat, filled the air. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were waiting for her to fail. The chamber was packed wall to wall. Lobbyists from trillion-dollar infrastructure firms, federal contractors in silk ties, and a row of conservative senators who hadn't blinked once during the last 5 corruption hearings. At the center of it all, presiding over this so-called budget inquiry, sat an unmistakable figure, Chief Justice John Roberts. His presence was unprecedented. The Supreme Court didn't meddle in fiscal hearings, not unless something or someone was a threat. And to him, Jasmine Crockett was that threat. The second she began to speak, Roberts cut her off like a guillotine. "Let's spare us the emotional rhetoric," he said, voice flat but sharp. "I trust you brought more than just moral outrage this time, Congresswoman." Laughter hissed from a cluster of suits seated behind the defense table. Jasmine paused, her hands steady on the binder she had carried into the room, her lips pressing into a line. She didn't reply. Not yet. Behind Roberts loomed a wall of institutional power. Judges, donors, corporate counsel, even a few media figures she recognized from the Sunday shows. It was clear this wasn't just a hearing, it was a warning, a spectacle arranged to discredit her before she could speak. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to play defense, and they had made one fatal mistake, assuming she had come alone, unarmed. They had no idea what was in that binder, or what she was about to reveal. She didn't flinch, not even as the room settled into that smug silence, the kind that hangs like smoke when the powerful believe they've already won. Jasmine stepped forward, placed her binder on the table with the precision of a surgeon before an incision, and opened it with deliberate calm. The first document she held up was a government-verified allocation report. Her voice was steady but cold enough to cut steel. The total congressional authorization for the National Infrastructure Expansion Act was $3.1 billion, she stated, letting the number hang in the air. That figure is confirmed across appropriations records, committee logs, and Treasury dispersals. She slid the document onto the projection screen, but then she reached into the binder again, deeper this time, and pulled out the real weapon, an internal ledger marked confidential, bearing the logo of Stratus Core Industries, one of the primary contractors. But according to this, she continued, her finger tracing the damning total on screen, their actual expenditures ballooned to over $6 billion, nearly double. No congressional addendums, no secondary authorization, no explanation. The murmurs in the room began to shift pitch, from amusement to unease, and Roberts still hadn't said a word. Jasmine locked eyes with him now. "Somewhere," she said, $2.9 billion slipped through the cracks, and nobody in this room thought to ask why. She flipped to the next page, a breakdown of project phases, subcontractor payments, and non-disclosure payouts, all signed off without oversight. 16 shell companies, she added, were created in less than 10 days, all tied to the same 3 addresses in Delaware. Each moved funds offshore within 48 hours of receiving federal transfers. A sharp intake of breath came from the gallery. She let it land, then fired the final shot of the sequence. And here's the kicker. 5 of those companies share a compliance auditor who also happens to sit on the Chief Justice's private advisory board. Her finger pointed not at the screen, but at Roberts himself. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture. And just like that, the silence broke. Not with applause, but with the shattering realization that the room was no longer under his control. The air had shifted, not from any sudden movement, but from something deeper, an unspoken recognition that the power dynamic in the room was no longer as solid as it had seemed. Jasmine's last words had landed with force, and though no one dared admit it aloud, their weight was undeniable. She had gone beyond presenting numbers. She had drawn a map, one line with money trails, shell corporations, and names no one ever thought would be spoken in this room. The silence wasn't respect. It was the stunned recoil of a system realizing it had just been cracked. That's when Roberts, who until now had maintained his usual measured detachment, finally moved to shut it down. His tone turned sharp, almost paternal, laced with the kind of arrogance only years of unchecked authority can build. "You can read numbers from whatever documents you please, Congresswoman," he said, every syllable coated in disdain. "But let's be clear, this isn't your courtroom." It was meant to end her momentum, to re-establish control with one clean, belittling blow. The words hung in the air like a reprimand from a teacher who'd grown too comfortable treating students as problems. A few murmurs of agreement stirred from the back, senators shifting in their seats, aides scribbling with renewed aggression. But Jasmine didn't rise to it. She didn't match his tone or defend her place. She didn't need to. Instead, she quietly lifted the next document from her binder, her fingers steady, the paper already trembling slightly. Not from her hands, but from the building anticipation of what it carried. She placed it beneath the projector, and the image bloomed on the courtroom screen with clinical clarity. "This isn't about whose courtroom it is," she said, her voice low, controlled. "It's about who signed off on a financial maneuver that no oversight committee ever saw." And there it was, a page from an internal authorization request, stamped with federal clearance and bearing one line at the bottom that sent an electric jolt through the room. J. Roberts, signed in clean, deliberate ink. Beside it, the title, Honorary Advisory Chair, Federal Interagency Budget Acceleration Committee. The silence that followed was immediate and total. It didn't feel like a dramatic pause. It felt like the breath before impact, like everyone in the room had just realized they were standing on unstable ground. No one moved. No one whispered. No one even coughed. The light from the projector cast an eerie glow over the chamber, illuminating the name at the bottom of the document as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even blink. Her posture was still, her expression calm, but her presence now filled the entire room. Not through volume, through certainty, through truth that couldn't be waved away. For the first time, Jasmine Crockett wasn't being tolerated as an outsider in a room built to silence her. She was being seen as what she had always been, the only one in the room unafraid to hold even the highest accountable. And Chief Justice John Roberts, once the immovable centerpiece of the American judicial order, was no longer above the facts she had just laid bare. The document had landed like a depth charge, sending silent shockwaves through the courtroom. But Jasmine Crockett knew that ink, no matter how damning, could still be spun. Buried under layers of legal jargon, denied with a furrowed brow and a polished press statement, what couldn't be spun, what couldn't be explained away, was a voice, a real one, caught not in the language of policy or procedure, but in the raw, unfiltered currency of truth. She didn't grandstand. She didn't smirk. Instead, she reached into the side pocket of her briefcase and pulled out a compact recorder. Black, unremarkable, almost too small to carry what it held. Slowly, deliberately, she placed it on the evidence table. Her eyes never left the bench. "With the court's permission," she said, her voice as even as a level plane before a storm, "I'd like to play an audio excerpt tied directly to the discrepancies we just reviewed." Justice Roberts didn't lift his head right away. His fingers laced together, knuckles white from pressure, before he finally glanced up with barely disguised impatience. He didn't speak. He gestured. A small flicking wave of his right hand, dismissive, theatrical, the kind of gesture that says, "This won't matter." It was not permission, but condescension dressed in decorum. Jasmine understood the signal perfectly, and then, without ceremony, she pressed play. A crackle of static broke the air, sharp, fleeting, followed by a pause, and then it came. A man's voice, calm, confident, dangerously casual. Just delete the ledgers. No one's coming after Roberts. The words fell like a slow-motion collision. Not loud, not screamed, but precise, so unguarded that they carried their own undeniable authenticity. You didn't need to see the man to know he believed what he was saying. That's what made it so devastating. It wasn't fear, it was certainty. The voice had the cold clarity of someone who had operated in the shadows for too long and knew exactly where the protections were and who had placed them there. The gallery shifted. A low murmur rolled across the courtroom. Someone dropped a pen. A reporter's eyes went wide. One juror turned instinctively toward Roberts. Jasmine didn't rush to explain. She let the silence stretch, let the implications settle deep in every corner of the room like dust after an explosion. Then with the same composure, she spoke. Measured, direct. That voice belongs to Martin Cleary, Deputy Chief Financial Officer of Stratus Core Holdings, and the Roberts he's referring to is the man seated at the head of this bench. No one moved. The sentence had weight, not just in meaning, but in clarity. She didn't say, allegedly. She didn't hedge. She named him. Directly, clearly, on the record. Roberts didn't lean back this time. He straightened, too quickly. His spine locked, jaw clenched, eyes darting not toward Jasmine but to the recorder, as if wishing it out of existence. His voice came sharp, loud, and unmistakably rattled. The recording has no legal standing. It's inadmissible. But the tremor behind the words betrayed the man behind the robe. It wasn't just the protest of a jurist. It was the recoil of someone who, for the first time, realized the walls might not hold. Jasmine had heard that tone before, from men used to being the final word, right up until the truth started talking louder than they could. And now the room had heard it too. Not just his words, but his fear. The denial had come swiftly from Roberts' mouth, sharp and brittle. The recording has no legal standing. It's inadmissible. But its impact was like a lit match dropped in a room soaked in gasoline. The effect was immediate and irreversible. The murmurs began almost imperceptibly, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Then the shift became unmistakable. Members of the audience leaned in, whispering with increasing urgency. The expressions on their faces were no longer bored or skeptical. They were tight with disbelief, recognition, and fear. Across the back row, reporters froze mid-sentence. Not a single key struck a keyboard. And then, as if by silent agreement, they lifted their phones in near unison. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was turning into a spectacle, one that would be replayed, streamed, and dissected on every screen in America within hours. Jasmine saw it happening, but she didn't flinch. She didn't soak in it. She moved forward, her actions as calm as the center of a collapsing system. She stepped toward the clerk's desk with measured precision, holding a sealed folder marked in red. Evidence. Do not duplicate. Her hand didn't tremble as she passed it forward. For the record, she said, her voice cutting clean through the layered hum of rising tension, the audio you just heard was pulled directly from an ongoing federal investigation conducted by the FBI. The clerk took the folder, peeled back the seal, and reviewed the contents with wide, blinking eyes. Jasmine gave him a moment. She wanted the court to see that nothing she presented today had come cheap or easy. This wasn't guesswork. This was a war waged through subpoenas, hard drives, redacted pages, and whistleblowers who risked careers to speak. She turned slightly to face the bench and continued. This recording was captured under a legally authorized wiretap with a federal court subpoena. Chain of custody is intact. Metadata has been reviewed, and the source has been confirmed. Her tone didn't waver. She wasn't just presenting facts. She was protecting them from the smears that would inevitably follow. A flicker of flashbulb light illuminated her face for a second, a symbol of clarity in a room that had thrived on shadows. She turned back to Roberts, and this time, when she looked at him, it wasn't with accusation, it was with finality. The kind of finality that told the whole room, we have crossed the line between speculation and evidence, between noise and consequence. It's not just admissible, she said, her voice softer now, but sharper than ever. It's not just legal. She paused, letting the silence work for her, letting truth reclaim its gravity. It's the truth. The words, "it's the truth," still echoed across the chamber when Jasmine stepped to the center of the floor and took a quiet breath. Not out of hesitation, but to steady the blade she was about to swing. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had crystallized. There was no more noise, no whispered disbelief. Everyone was listening now, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't afford not to. The facade had cracked. Now it was time to tear down the foundation. "We've established the signature," she said, her voice clear and unflinching, "and we've confirmed the voice. But today isn't about a single document or a single sentence. Today is about a system built to conceal." She walked to the digital projector, clicked a remote in her palm, and the screen behind her lit up with the first slide. A complex flowchart, color-coded, branching like veins across a body. "Let me show you how the money moved." The room leaned in, drawn toward the glow of something normally hidden in sealed files and off-record conversations. "It begins with taxpayer funds," Jasmine narrated, using a laser pointer to trace the flow. "Federal allocations approved through the Infrastructure Expansion Act, legitimate, on paper, distributed to 3 primary development firms, Stratuscore, Meridian Urban, and Havenstone Group." The names lit up in blue boxes across the screen, connected by thick arrows to the next layer of the chart. But within 72 hours of receiving those funds, each of these firms rerouted portions of their profits, some labeled consulting fees, others expedited review charges, into offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. The arrows now curved away from the U.S. flag watermark in the center, looping toward faceless black boxes marked with routing codes. "These accounts," Jasmine continued, voice steady but sharp, "are not corporate. They're private, unnamed, shielded." A second slide replaced the first, revealing account registration data. Dozens of transactions, timestamps, masked entities. "But we didn't stop there," she said, "because one shell company, Marston Consulting, was linked to all 3 development firms, and Marston's account was used repeatedly to wire funds to a trust listed under the name Lexbridge International Legal Advisory." She paused just long enough for the room to catch up. "That trust, registered in Luxembourg, is operated through a U.S.-based foundation that shares board members with the Federal Judicial Strategic Council Advisory Panel." That name sent ripples through the gallery, familiar to some, but rarely mentioned. Jasmine clicked again. A new document filled the screen, an annual report from the trust itself. It was dry, technical, but one line stood out in bold. "Director of Legal Discretionary Disbursements, J. Roberts." She didn't speak immediately. The room needed a second. The weight of what she had just shown, names, paths, transfers, had landed like concrete. "This isn't just poor oversight," she said finally, her voice low but undeniable. "This is design. This is architecture. This is the quiet laundering of influence beneath the cloak of legal process." She walked slowly back toward the center of the room, letting the silence expand before she clicked again. The final slide appeared. A scanned image of an expedited development permit, approved weeks before the funding was even formally released. The stamp at the bottom was clear, elegant cursive, familiar. Signature, J. Roberts. Gasps were no longer subtle. Someone audibly muttered, "Oh my God." A woman in the second row instinctively covered her mouth. One of the aides at the back stood halfway out of his seat, unsure whether to sit or run. Jasmine let the screen speak for itself. She didn't pace. She didn't point. She just stood there, the embodiment of stillness against a wall of unraveling power. Then she spoke. "Chief Justice Roberts," she said, her voice softer now, deliberate, like every syllable was measured against the weight of truth, "signed 3 of these permits in a personal capacity as an honorary consultant for an interagency committee that, on paper, does not even have budgetary authority. And yet these permits resulted in over $400 million in redirected contracts. Contracts that ended up feeding the very shell structures we just traced." She turned to face him now. "Your name is on all of them." Roberts didn't speak. Not yet. He shifted slightly, his shoulders rising like he was bracing for impact. His jaw moved, but no words came. The usual confidence in his posture, refined over decades of commanding courtrooms, shaping precedent, controlling narrative, had evaporated. What remained was a man pinned beneath the weight of exposure, not by angry rhetoric, not by protest, but by paperwork, by receipts, by trails he thought would never be followed. Jasmine looked back at the screen. The Cayman accounts, the legal trust, the development permits, the authorization memos. They don't point to a clerical error. They point to an ecosystem, one that protects the powerful, insulates the connected, and punishes anyone who questions it. She turned again, slowly scanning the room. So I'll ask this chamber what I've been asking since the first day I saw these ledgers. How much silence is a signature worth? No one moved. The weight of her words had paralyzed the room. And in that stillness, the final slide remained glowing behind her. The signature of a Supreme Court Chief Justice, tied not to law, but to money. And it wasn't just the scandal that was horrifying. It was the clarity. It was the precision. It was the fact that no one, not a senator, not a lobbyist, not even Roberts himself, could deny what had just been laid bare. The money moved. The signatures were real, and justice for once was louder than fear. The signature still burned on the screen behind her, but it wasn't ink that had ignited the room. It was the implication. Jasmine had done what no one thought possible. She had connected the dots, piece by piece, and laid them bare for all to see. The web was no longer theory. It was diagrammed, color-coded, signed, and verified. The money, the trusts, the offshore accounts, they all pointed in one direction, toward the man in the center of the room. And in that moment, for the first time in his storied, protected, untouchable career, Chief Justice John Roberts felt the one thing he'd spent a lifetime avoiding: exposure. It hit him like a recoil. The silence was suffocating, and so he did what powerful men often do when cornered: not explain, not refute, but explode. He shot up in his seat, voice booming, face taut with fury that barely concealed the crack beneath. "This is politically motivated slander," he shouted, his palms slapping the edge of the bench with such force that it echoed like a dropped gavel. An orchestrated spectacle meant to discredit this court and tear down the legitimacy of the entire system. The words came fast, louder with each phrase, not to persuade the room, but to reclaim it. But they didn't land as conviction. They landed as panic. Everyone could hear it. Everyone could feel it. The roar of a man not defending truth, but drowning in it. He scanned the room, searching for nods of loyalty, for someone, anyone to rescue him, with a look, a gesture, a defense. But there were none. The senators behind him had gone rigid. The aides weren't writing. The lobbyists stared straight ahead like hostages caught in the wrong room. Even the reporters, many of whom once idolized him, had their cameras fixed and still, not blinking, as if capturing the precise moment when history tilted. And Jasmine, she didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't take a step forward or lean into the theatrics. She simply stood, anchored, unshaken, her calm presence a direct rebuke to the rage unraveling in front of her. The moment he stopped shouting, she let the silence hold for just a breath longer. Then softly but firmly, she spoke. "It's not slander if it's backed by evidence." The words dropped with weight, not as retaliation, but as fact, as truth, cold and clear. And then she added, not to humiliate, but to remind the room of what was at stake. And if justice is truly blind, then it does not see power. It does not see robes. It does not see titles. It only sees truth. There was no applause, no murmur of support, just the silence of reckoning. The kind of silence that tells you something irreversible has happened, that a barrier has been crossed, a myth shattered. Jasmine didn't need to win the room with force. She had already won it with proof. And now the man who once ruled from behind a bench was left standing in front of it, grasping at dignity and finding none. The room was still reeling from Jasmine's final words. It only sees truth, when she reached once more into her briefcase. The crowd, already breathless, watched her movements as if the very act of opening a folder might tilt the world again. This time she pulled out a thick, slightly worn file stamped with a faded red mark. Federal Judicial Ethics Committee, confidential correspondence. It wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. This was not new evidence, this was old rot. Buried, sealed, forgotten. Jasmine didn't need to explain that. The weight of the folder said it for her. She took a steady step forward, her tone calm but carrying the clarity of a siren. "Since we're speaking of legitimacy," she said, letting her eyes sweep the room, "perhaps the court and the public should be reminded of what's been quietly buried beneath it." With a single press of her remote, the projector flickered, then illuminated a grainy scan of a memo from the Federal Judicial Ethics Oversight Commission. The letterhead was unmistakable. The signatures at the bottom, chillingly bureaucratic. The room tensed again, not from surprise, but from recognition. These weren't wild accusations. They were records, official, signed, stamped. "These are internal reports from the Judicial Ethics Oversight Commission," Jasmine continued. "3 separate complaints, spanning 7 years, all submitted by federal staffers, all alleging conflicts of interest and undisclosed financial ties involving Chief Justice John Roberts." She paused, not to dramatize, but to let the enormity of it land. These weren't leaks. They weren't anonymous tips. They were formal filings, lost in silence by design. She clicked again. A second page lit up, a timeline annotated in fine print, linking offshore trusts to ruling dates. She spoke with the steadiness of someone who had read these pages 100 times in the dead of night. Each complaint passed the preliminary threshold for review. Each raised concerns about offshore holdings, private legal consultancies, and case assignments that overlapped with personal financial beneficiaries. Her voice remained composed, but her words cut deeper with every syllable. She advanced to the next page, and the gallery leaned in unblinking. Yet none of these complaints ever triggered a public investigation. They were closed, quietly, internally. Without explanation, now came the final slide. One line of handwritten text scrawled across a closing memo. "No further action recommended. Optics risk is too high." No legal reasoning, no exoneration, just optics, just fear of headlines. And that was all it took to bury the truth. Jasmine faced the bench once more, and though her voice remained low, it now trembled with a different kind of power. Not anger, not accusation, but unrelenting moral clarity. This isn't about political theater, it's about pattern. A pattern of silence, suppression, and evasion. One that didn't begin today and won't end unless we force it into the light. She didn't need to say more. The room was still. The file was open. The truth had been documented, and now at last it had been heard. The final slide still glowed faintly on the screen. Those 7 handwritten words, "No further action recommended. Optics risk is too high." As if daring anyone in the room to pretend it meant less than it did. But no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the truth itself had shifted the weight of the oxygen. Jasmine stood in the center of it all, not as a performer, not even as an accuser anymore, but as the unwavering center of gravity in a room that had lost its balance. And in that suspended, almost sacred stillness, something changed. It began at the back of the chamber, not with fanfare, not with force, but with intent. The kind of quiet intent that doesn't need to announce itself. 3 figures appeared, moving down the center aisle with practiced efficiency. Suits dark, expressions unreadable, every step calibrated. There was no confusion about who they were. You didn't need to see the insignia. You felt it. The sharp posture of federal authority. The man in front, tall, composed, radiated the kind of certainty reserved for those who don't ask permission to speak. A thin badge rested at his hip, the seal of the United States Department of Justice. There was no escort, no red lights flashing, just 3 agents stepping into a room that had finally caught up with the weight of its own silence. Jasmine turned only slightly, catching the movement out of the corner of her eye. She didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She knew this moment. She had prepared for it, not with glee or vengeance, but with precision. She didn't need to read the warrant to know what it said. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice measured, steady, and unwavering. "Chief Justice John Roberts," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to absorb the weight of his words. "You are now the subject of a federal investigation. We are executing a lawful warrant to seize all devices, communications records, and physical materials related to the financial disclosures and case authorizations under inquiry." The courtroom didn't gasp, it didn't erupt, it froze. Not in the theatrical sense, there was no chaos, no screaming, but something deeper, more profound took hold. The complete and total stillness that happens only when the unthinkable becomes real. Reporters slowly lowered their phones as if afraid even to blink. The stenographer, halfway through a line of shorthand, stopped mid-stroke. A young staffer in the back row, who had moments ago looked bored, now sat as still as stone, hands clutched together in his lap. Even the marble walls of the chamber seemed to close in, absorbing the echo of the words they just heard. Roberts remained seated at first, stunned, not by the sound of the agent's voice, but by what it represented. The collapse of the illusion that had shielded him for decades. For the first time in his long and carefully guarded tenure, he was no longer the arbiter. He was the subject. The robe didn't protect him now. The bench didn't elevate him. He was just a man. A man surrounded by paperwork he had once hoped would never see light. Now illuminated under the brightest spotlight a courtroom can hold. Accountability. Then, with a stiffness born from pride refusing to bend, he rose. His hands gripped the edge of the bench with quiet defiance. His chin lifted, and with a carefully controlled breath, he stepped down from the elevated platform. Not with the command of a judge presiding over order, but with the weight of a man trying not to stumble beneath his own undoing. His eyes didn't search for help. Not anymore. He turned almost instinctively toward the side exit, the private door used by court officials, the door that, for years, had led him out of scrutiny and back into security. But he never reached it. The second agent moved before Roberts had taken 3 full steps. No aggression, no violence, just authority, quiet and absolute. He stepped directly into Roberts' path and extended a hand, not forceful but final. It was a gesture with no ambiguity. "You're not going anywhere." Roberts halted. The effect was immediate, like watching a man walk off a cliff and realize, too late, there's no ground beneath him. His shoulders sagged slightly. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at the agent, then past him, then toward the bench where he'd sat just moments ago as the nation's highest judicial figure. And now he was just one more name under investigation. One more man who believed the rules were for others, until they weren't. The room, packed with journalists, lawmakers, legal aides, and citizens, remained breathless. Jasmine stood motionless, her face unreadable. She didn't gloat. She didn't soften. She simply watched. And what she saw wasn't triumph. It was truth reclaiming its space. The kind of truth that doesn't roar. It just stands, unmovable, undeniable. It was the moment the power structure shifted, and everyone in that courtroom, everyone watching across the country, knew it. There would be debates later, defenses raised, commentators dissecting every detail, but none of that would change what had just happened in that room. Justice had come down from the bench, and it was no longer wearing a robe. The silence in the courtroom had barely lifted when the outside world erupted. Moments after Chief Justice John Roberts was blocked from exiting, moments after Jasmine Crockett stood without blinking as the Department of Justice read him into a federal investigation, one of the reporters, quietly, almost instinctively, hit upload. A raw, unedited clip, shaky from adrenaline but steady enough to capture everything. Robert's voice cracking under pressure, Jasmine's unshakable response, the unmistakable phrase, "You are now the subject of a federal investigation." That 30-second clip hit the internet like a thunderclap. By the time Roberts was escorted to a private holding room, it had already reached 500,000 views. Within 2 hours, it had surpassed 3 million. By midnight, it had crossed 12 million. Every platform, YouTube, X, Instagram, even TikTok, was saturated with the same stunned reaction. Did that really just happen? The hashtags exploded. # Justice Unrobed, # Crockett versus Roberts, # The Bench Falls. Network producers scrambled to reconfigure their evening lineups. Legal correspondents were called into studios late at night wearing wrinkled shirts and panic in their eyes. It wasn't just the arrest, it was how it happened. The calm, deliberate dismantling, the clarity of evidence, the moral conviction in Jasmine's voice, the absence of grandstanding, no theatrics, just truth, wielded like a scalpel. By morning, major media outlets weren't asking whether it was real. They were asking something bigger. What does this mean? Across cable news, the tone was no longer defensive. It was reverent, almost shaken. CNN's Kyron read, "Unprecedented, Chief Justice under federal investigation." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened her segment with, "We just watched a woman walk into a room where the law was dying in silence and bring it back to life with evidence." Even Fox News, usually a fortress of skepticism, couldn't deny the seismic nature of what had unfolded. A panel of commentators, some clearly uncomfortable, sat in stunned agreement as one of their own admitted, "This isn't political anymore. This is structural. This is history punching through the walls of the system." By noon, law schools were hosting emergency live streams. Students at Harvard, Stanford, Georgetown, and NYU gathered around projectors, dissecting Jasmine's argumentation frame by frame. Professors who had spent decades defending institutional neutrality now found themselves answering a question they'd once dismissed as academic fiction. Is this the turning point in American judicial accountability? The question echoed far beyond the ivory towers. Editorial boards weighed in. The New York Times called it a moment of reckoning. The Washington Post used the phrase judicial collapse or judicial rebirth. Even The Atlantic published a midnight column titled "Jasmine Crockett in the Court That Forgot the Constitution." Meanwhile, the clip kept spreading, recut into reels, set to music, turned into duets by young activists and law interns across the country. But the original? It needed no edit, no soundtrack, no amplification, because it was already perfect, raw, relentless, real. And in every version, one line stood at the center, one voice. It's not slander if it's backed by evidence. And if justice is truly blind, it does not see power. It does not see robes. It does not see titles. It only sees truth. That line became a rallying cry, projected on banners at protests, printed on T-shirts, painted on murals in cities Jasmine had never even visited. For those who had watched the courts become symbols of distance and exclusion, that single moment was something sacred, something restorative, a breach in the wall, proof that even the highest seat in the land could not escape the reach of courage tied to truth. But underneath the celebration, the tension remained, not fear, but awareness. Everyone understood what Jasmine had just done. She hadn't just revealed corruption, she had exposed the system's willingness to protect it. She hadn't just challenged a man, she had indicted a mythology, that the black robe was immune, that the highest power was beyond scrutiny, that legitimacy could exist without accountability. She tore that myth down, calmly, thoroughly, and without ever raising her voice. And the world watched. Not in disbelief, but in awe. Because for the first time in years, Americans weren't just witnessing justice. They believed it might actually be possible again. The country was still catching its breath from the courtroom fallout when Jasmine Crockett made her next move. Not on a stage, not at a podium, but in a locked conference room 4 floors below the Capitol Rotunda. It was early, barely 7 a.m., and the air still smelled faintly of copier ink and burned coffee. But inside that room, a new battle was already underway. Jasmine sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled, documents spread across the surface like a blueprint for war. She wasn't alone. Beside her were forensic accountants, ex-prosecutors, ethics professors, and 2 whistleblowers who had testified in private under threat of retaliation. What they were building wasn't just a task force. It was a reckoning. They called it the Truth Bench, a name born not from branding, but from conviction. A new commission, civilian-backed and legally armored, designed to do what no internal body had dared to do before, trace the money behind the robe. The transition from viral hero to institutional architect wasn't instant, but it was immediate. Jasmine knew she couldn't wait for Congress to act. She had seen what delay looked like. She had testified before chairs who looked away, who filibustered with pleasantries while corruption festered beneath their feet. So she moved first. Within 72 hours of Roberts' removal, she drafted and filed a legislative proposal for federal judicial transparency, then launched Truthbench as an independent investigative body with real teeth. Full subpoena power, public reporting mandates, and partnerships with financial oversight agencies that had long been left in the cold. The first target? Undisclosed holdings by federal judges, not just at the Supreme Court, but circuit and appellate levels too. She wanted to know who owned what, where it was hidden, and who had benefited. The response from the judiciary was immediate and visceral. Anonymous sources leaked emails from panicked clerks. Judges held emergency meetings to discuss procedural overreach, but it was too late. Jasmine had flipped the switch, and the public was watching now. Every move was under scrutiny. The Truthbench website, launched with little fanfare, received over 2 million visits in its first 24 hours. Citizens submitted tips, some vague, others dangerously specific. One clerk, using only the alias Thermidor, submitted a cache of internal communications showing how financial disclosure forms were quietly edited after submission. Another sent scans of emails between judges and investment fund executives, threads that included phrases like "no paper trail" and "just call me." But Jasmine didn't stop at the tip of the iceberg. She aimed at the base. She filed a federal request requiring all sitting federal judges to submit revised financial disclosures, this time under the penalty of perjury and backed by third-party audits. The resistance was immediate. One circuit judge threatened resignation on live radio, claiming it was a politically motivated witch hunt. But the tide had turned. The public wasn't swayed by bluster anymore. They had seen a Chief Justice fall, and now they wanted to know how far the rot went. On Capitol Hill, the pressure mounted. Lawmakers who had once cowered before the judiciary were now publicly demanding reforms. Hearings were called, subcommittees formed. Jasmine was invited, reluctantly at first, to testify again. This time she didn't arrive alone. She brought charts, timelines, sworn affidavits. She spoke in clipped, exacting language, like a prosecutor building a closing argument for the country itself. "The judiciary," she said into the microphone, "is the only branch of government that expects to wield unchecked power without transparency. That ends now." Behind her, the gallery erupted, not in applause, but in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that understands history when it hears it. And outside the chamber, something even bigger was happening. Dozens of judges across the country, quietly, strategically, began revising their public filings. Some removed ambiguous trusts. Others suddenly disclosed travel gifts and consulting retainers they had conveniently forgotten. A handful stepped down altogether, issuing bland statements about personal reasons and timing. But the public didn't buy it. They were watching the Truthbench updates in real time. Every resignation, every amended filing, every link uncovered was charted on a national transparency dashboard, color-coded, time-stamped, archived. And at the center of it all was Jasmine, not as a celebrity, not as a crusader, but as something rarer, a leader who had turned her moment of confrontation into a structure for accountability, who had faced down the most powerful judge in the land, and instead of stopping there, had built a system so the next time, no one would have to do it alone. This wasn't just about John Roberts anymore. It was about every silent signature, every closed-door ruling, every ledger that was lost. And it was about what comes next when justice finally dares to look at itself in the mirror. But just as the public began to believe the hardest truth had already been exposed, a darker current surfaced beneath the wave Jasmine had unleashed. While Truthbench continued tracking amendments and quiet resignations, a new set of documents landed, this time not through subpoenas, but through an encrypted Dropbox linked to an anonymous account known only as Breaker of Vaults. Jasmine's team received the first batch in the dead of night. No subject line, no message, just one zip file with a chilling label. Archstone, Core 001. At first glance, it seemed like a standard archive. Memos, emails, donor records. But within hours, the pattern emerged. This wasn't just about Roberts. This wasn't even about individual judges. What unfolded was a meticulously hidden ecosystem, a coordinated network spanning over 30 years, embedding itself deep into the very bones of America's judicial and political institutions. The project had a name, Archstone, neat, corporate, unassuming. But inside that name lived rot on a structural level. The documents traced the movement of money through a latticework of nonprofits, advisory boards, backdoor consulting contracts, and private foundations. Judicial fellows were placed on panels under the guise of academic outreach. In reality, they were paid retainers, lucrative ones, funded by shell corporations that, when followed far enough, always circled back to the same dozen financial entities. These companies donated to both political parties. They weren't partisan. They were transactional. They didn't care who sat on the bench, only that they could be reached, traced, bent, paid. And Chief Justice John Roberts? He wasn't the architect. He was a link, one polished, publicly presentable node in a chain that ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. The revelations exploded like a controlled detonation across Jasmine's war room. Names of current judges appeared beside retired lawmakers, former cabinet secretaries, and media executives. Memos between political consultants openly referenced Archstone-approved rulings as deliverables. One document, a PowerPoint presentation dated nearly 15 years earlier, included a slide titled Discrete Influence Pathways, Judicial Edition. Another listed targets with color-coded reliability tiers from green to red. Next to each was a small notation, cultivated, needs re-engagement, unresponsive. Jasmine stared at that list for nearly a minute without speaking. She didn't need a decoder. The language was plain. Human beings, judges, were being tracked like assets, managed like accounts, and paid like subcontractors. Still, the most damning file came in the second batch. A master ledger of payments disguised as consulting disbursements, routed through charitable legal funds. One entry, dated 9 months before a major environmental ruling, was highlighted in yellow. The recipient, a federal judge who had authored the majority opinion favoring a mining conglomerate. The amount, $1.2 million. Labeled as a strategic review honorarium, the fund that issued it later dissolved, reborn under a new name. But the board members remained exactly the same. Jasmine exhaled slowly, realizing what they had been fighting wasn't corruption in the shadows. It was corruption dressed as policy, speaking in the language of legitimacy, wearing the mask of law. She called an emergency press conference that night, but not to explain, to warn. This is no longer about one courtroom, she said, standing before a national press corps that now treated her like the last reliable witness in a house collapsing under its own weight. This is a network, not theoretical, not speculative, real, structured, and deliberate. She held up a printed chart, veins of connections sprawling like a cancer diagnosis across the surface. They called it Archstone, and for 30 years it has distorted rulings, influenced decisions, and protected power, not through intimidation, but through access, through money, through silence. She didn't name names, not yet. The investigation was still expanding, too sensitive to drop every match at once. But the room didn't need more fuel. Reporters looked stunned. Even those who had doubted her early on now stared as if they were watching a crack form in the very wall behind her. The truth wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was radioactive. In the days that followed, Jasmine's office was inundated with messages. Some were threats, veiled in legal jargon. Others were apologies, from former clerks, old allies who had turned a blind eye, even sitting judges who now feared they were being watched. And they were right. Truthbench had been forced to expand, hiring digital security experts, investigators fluent in financial forensics, and even a retired federal auditor who confessed with shame in his voice, "I saw signs of this in 2004. I just never put it together." The uncovering of Archstone didn't shake the system. It revealed the system. Roberts was never the story. He was the doorway. and Jasmine had just kicked it wide open. The revelations surrounding Archstone had detonated across the nation like a legal earthquake. But it wasn't enough to stop at exposure. Jasmine knew that. Corruption doesn't die in silence. It adapts, shifts, burrows deeper. And so, just 48 hours after the second round of leaked documents went public, she stepped in front of the largest crowd she had faced since the beginning of the investigation. The backdrop wasn't a courtroom or a Senate hearing. It was the steps of the old courthouse in Philadelphia, one of the oldest halls of law in the country. The air was biting cold, but the plaza was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, activists, legal scholars, and citizens, some in business suits, others in hooded sweatshirts and winter gloves, but all with their eyes locked on the woman who had dared to speak when everyone else had chosen silence. She approached the podium without security fanfare. No entourage, no bulletproof glass. Just a single folder in her hand and the weight of a broken system on her shoulders. The cameras clicked like rapid fire, but she waited, silent, until the last murmurs faded. And then, with a voice firm but unscripted, she began. "For too long," she said, scanning the crowd, "we have been told that integrity trickles down from the highest offices, that trust in our institutions must be maintained at all costs, even if that cost is truth." She held up the folder, its contents known now to millions. "But I have read what lies behind the curtain. I have followed the money. I have seen the emails, the handshakes, the signatures carved into decisions that ruin lives. And I can tell you this, trust cannot be maintained through secrets. It must be earned in daylight." Then she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as the weight of her next words gathered behind her chest like thunder. "A justice system," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry over the crowd, "cannot exist if those who sit at the highest benches are immune to the truth." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. It was too heavy for applause, too real. Her statement was not an accusation. It was a challenge. A mirror held up to the black-robed sanctuaries that had shielded the powerful for generations. And every person there, every person watching from a phone or a laptop or a late-night broadcast, understood. Something irreversible had been spoken. She stepped back slightly from the microphone, and immediately a reporter shouted over the sea of equipment, his voice cutting through the air like a thrown spear. "Congresswoman Crockett," he called out, "with everything you've exposed, the names, the networks, the threats, are you afraid?" There was a pause, not hesitation, consideration. Jasmine turned her face toward the crowd and answered not with hesitation or rhetoric, but with a force so clean it stunned even the most cynical voices. "Fear keeps people quiet," she said, not smiling, not posturing. "I choose to speak." There it was, simple, undeniable, the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout, it just lands. And as the words echoed off the courthouse stone, it was clear they weren't meant for the reporter. They weren't even meant for the cameras. They were meant for every young law student watching from a dorm room, every clerk who had seen too much and said too little, every ordinary citizen who had once believed the system was too big to question. Then slowly, Jasmine stepped away from the podium. No anthem played, no guards followed, no staffer whispered in her ear. She simply walked down the stone steps alone, through the wind, through the silence, her heels clicking like a gavel on concrete. Her coat flared slightly as the breeze caught its edge, but her pace never changed. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, deliberate, unflinching. In that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman or a lawyer or a headline. She was something the country hadn't seen in a long time, a symbol of justice that didn't bow, not to robes, not to titles, not to threats. And the nation knew it wasn't just truth that had been spoken that day. It was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. It was belief, reborn. The air hadn't quite settled when Jasmine disappeared from view, her figure retreating slowly into the cold, gray light of a nation still trembling from what it had just witnessed. There were no triumphant speeches, no parades, no declarations of victory. Just a silence so deep it seemed to hum with meaning. A silence not of uncertainty, but of revelation. For many, the events that had unfolded over the past weeks felt like the climax of a political thriller. The kind of story that burns across front pages and talk shows before fading into history. But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't a story. It was a warning. And for those listening closely, buried beneath the headlines and hashtags, was something more enduring than scandal. A lesson. One not written in legal codes or legislative language, but carved into the raw terrain of human conscience. Because what Jasmine faced wasn't just institutional resistance, it was generational denial. She didn't walk into a courtroom filled with curiosity or fairness. She walked into a fortress, one built from marble and myth, layered with decades of unspoken rules. Don't question the robed. Don't embarrass the powerful. Don't ask who benefits from silence. That wasn't a courtroom, it was a shrine. And shrines don't welcome confrontation. They punish it. From the moment she opened her mouth, the system reacted not with logic, but with reflex. She was mocked, interrupted, dismissed. Her evidence was called theatrics. Her warnings were labeled emotional. Her voice, sharpened by law and forged in purpose, was treated as an inconvenience to tradition. And yet, she kept speaking. That, in itself, is a lesson. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it holds its ground. It's easy to believe that truth alone is enough, that if the evidence is strong, the facts clean, and the chain of custody intact, then justice will simply follow. But Jasmine knew better. The truth is never just about what you have. It's about what you're willing to risk to say it out loud. Because the systems designed to dispense justice are often the first to reject it when it points inward. Jasmine stood in front of a Chief Justice, an icon, a symbol of order, and said the one thing the system fears more than exposure. You are not above the people you judge. And in doing so, she didn't just risk her reputation. She risked her safety, her career, her peace. That's not drama. That's the human cost of accountability. There were moments, quiet ones, never caught on camera, when she sat alone reviewing files long past midnight, knowing that with every name she exposed, every dollar she traced, another powerful enemy would be added to the list. There were nights she received encrypted emails from strangers who said they had evidence, but were too afraid to speak. Nights when security detail had to sweep her hotel room twice, when staffers begged her to delay, to wait for the process. But Jasmine didn't wait, because she had seen what delay looked like. It looked like lives ruined by bad rulings, communities torn apart by neutral decisions funded by private interest. It looked like decades of erosion disguised as precedent. The greatest injustice isn't a corrupt decision, it's the silence that follows it. That's the lesson buried in the glare of this moment, that justice doesn't simply fail when bad actors act. It fails when good people refuse to act at all, when they trade truth for proximity to power, when they choose comfort over clarity, when they measure their integrity by what won't cost them a seat at the table. Jasmine didn't do that. She chose the hard road, the one littered with backlash and headlines and sleepless nights. And for that, she became something rare in American political life. Not a hero, but a mirror. A reflection of what the system could be if it stopped protecting itself long enough to serve the people beneath it. What she revealed about Roberts was devastating, yes. But what she revealed about us, the public, the press, the political class, was even more damning. We had normalized the untouchable robe. We had made excuses for opaqueness. We had accepted that judges didn't need to disclose, didn't need to explain, didn't need to answer. And when Jasmine forced that answer into the open, we were all confronted with a question. Why did it take so long? The lesson is not that corruption exists. That's no longer a revelation. The lesson is how easily it's allowed to fester when people mistake power for wisdom and process for justice. But perhaps the most radical part of Jasmine's message wasn't in what she exposed, but how she carried herself in the storm. She didn't retaliate with insults. She didn't turn the courtroom into a circus. She didn't posture for the cameras. She walked into each confrontation armed not with outrage, but with order, with facts, with evidence, with receipts. And when the system tried to shame her into retreat, she didn't raise her volume. She sharpened her language. When they called her a disruptor, she became a builder. She founded Truth Bench, not as a monument to her victory, but as a shield for those who would come after. She didn't just survive the fire, she built an institution in its ashes. The message? Don't wait to be invited into the room where decisions are made. Drag the truth in with you. And if they try to push you out, make the door wider. Jasmine's story is not a singular one. It is a call to all who have ever been told to wait their turn, to every whistleblower choking on the weight of their silence, to every clerk who's redacted too much, to every student told not to challenge their professor. It is a reminder that the path of resistance is not paved in comfort. It is built step by step, word by word, document by document, until the wall cracks. And make no mistake, the wall is cracking now. So what now? Now you act. In whatever space you occupy, you act not out of guilt, but out of clarity. Out of the understanding that justice doesn't trickle from the Supreme Court down. It rises from classrooms, from courtrooms, from conversations where people finally stop editing their truth to keep others comfortable. It rises when you challenge a sentencing policy that's buried under bureaucratic jargon. When you vote in local elections that appoint judges with unchecked power. When you ask why Black teenagers are labeled threats, while white ones are called troubled. And when you refuse to accept that silence equals civility. You act by learning the names of the judges on your ballot, not just the celebrities on the bench. You look up their records. You attend school board meetings where disciplinary policies are often early blueprints for courtroom disparities. You listen, especially to the stories that don't end with perfect victims or clear heroes. Because real justice lives in the gray, and that's where the work begins. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose corruption, she reminded us who justice belongs to. Not the robe, not the title, not the bench. United States. And now that the smoke has cleared and the truth is no longer whispering from the shadows, but screaming from every screen in the nation, there's only one question left. What will you do with it? Because Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom for spectacle. She didn't risk her safety to deliver a monologue. She cracked open the walls of power so the rest of us could see what's been rotting behind them. And once you've seen it, you don't get to look away. You don't get to scroll past it. You don't get to say that's politics and turn off the screen. Because this isn't just politics. This is justice held hostage. This is power wrapped in robes and protected by silence. This is your vote, your future, your rights being negotiated in backrooms and buried beneath procedural discretion. And now, because one woman chose to speak, you don't have to guess anymore. You know, and once you know, you act. Start local. That's where they hide the rot. Under ballot lines you've never read, behind judges' names you've never Googled. Look up who's running your courts. Dig into how they rule. Ask why family court decisions go unchecked. Ask who's funding the next judicial candidate. Show up to your city council meetings, not once, every month. Become the eyes they can't ignore. And if you're told to stay quiet, get louder. If you're told it's complicated, demand clarity. They're counting on your exhaustion, on your belief that systems are too big to fight. But Jasmine proved they're not. She didn't have the most power in the room. She had the most purpose. And that's all it takes to change everything. Not perfection, not permission, just persistence. Demand transparency. Not as a favor, but as your right. Push for financial disclosures from judges at every level. Call your representatives. Flood their inboxes. Don't wait for the next scandal to act. Prevent the next one with pressure, with presence. Support legislation that strengthens judicial accountability. If no such legislation exists where you live, write it. Find others. Build coalitions. Make noise. They won't give up power easily, so don't ask nicely. Take the outrage you feel and turn it into law, into structure, into permanent, public, traceable oversight. Let Truth Bench be the beginning, not the exception. And more than anything, protect those who speak. Stand with the whistleblower, the teacher, the intern, the junior staffer who dares to question the silence, because they are the next Jasmine. And this country can't afford to let them stand alone. Courage is contagious, but so is abandonment. Be the reason someone else doesn't give up. Be the proof that truth still has allies. This is your moment now, not hers, not theirs, yours. Jasmine lit the match. It's your job to carry the fire. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.